The crowd did not look dangerous at first. That is the part I remember. Not a riot, not madness, not violence, just people arriving late, scarves around their necks, tickets in their hands, eyes on the tunnel. And then, the tunnel kept taking them in. I was a steward at the Leppings Lane end that day, not an officer, not a commander, not someone with a radio that mattered. I wore a jacket, watched a gate, answered questions, pointed people towards signs, and tried to keep the movement steady. That was the job. Keep people moving, keep the way clear, keep calm. Before the match, the ground felt like any big match feels. Too many voices in one place, songs rising outside the turnstiles, programs folded under arms, children pulled along by fathers, men looking at watches, the smell of cigarettes, damp coats, police horses, and fried food. A football crowd has its own weather. It moves around you. It presses, then loosens. It complains, then laughs. It sings because singing makes waiting easier. At first, I thought that was all it was. Waiting. A crowd waiting to become an audience. I had seen busy gates before. I had seen people push toward turnstiles because no one wants to miss kickoff. I had seen frustration, shouting, hands raised, stewards telling people to slow down when everyone wanted to move faster. But that afternoon, the crowd outside did not loosen. It only grew. More scarves, more faces, more bodies at the same entrance. The sound changed first. That is how you know a crowd has stopped being comfortable. Not by the number, by the sound. The songs became broken. The jokes stopped traveling. Voices turned shorter. People began shouting single words. Move, open, wait, please. From where I stood, I could not see the whole outside approach, only pieces, a gate, a line of heads, police moving through gaps that closed behind them. Supporters pressed close enough that some no longer seemed to be walking. They were being carried by the pressure behind them. Inside the ground, the pitch was green and open. Outside the turnstiles, space had disappeared. Those two worlds sat beside each other like they had nothing to do with one another. That was the first wrong thing. The match was still a match. The crowd outside was becoming something else. I looked toward the tunnel. The tunnel under the stand led down toward the central pens behind the goal. It was obvious. Too obvious. If you came through and saw it, you went that way, straight ahead, down the slope, toward the sound of the ground, toward the pitch, toward the place you believed your ticket had promised you. There were other ways to the sides, but they did not pull the eye the same way. The tunnel did. It sat there like an open mouth. People entered it and vanished. For a while, that seemed normal. Then I noticed fewer people coming back out of the sightline. The flow went in, and the sound from the terrace began to change. I could not see clearly into the central pins from my position, but I could feel the difference. A football terrace should move. Even when packed, it shifts. Shoulders turn, arms lift. People bounce to songs. A terrace breathes. The central pins were not breathing. They looked full in a way that made the word full feel too small. Faces against metal, arms raised, not in celebration. Bodies no longer facing the pitch. People turned sideways, some looking back toward the tunnel, some looking up, some trying to climb. I told myself I was seeing it wrong. You do that when fear arrives before proof. You correct your own eyes. Maybe it was the angle. Maybe they were celebrating. Maybe they were trying to get a better view. Maybe, once the match started, the pressure would settle. A whistle can make a crowd move differently. A ball can pull attention forward. That is what I told myself. Then the gate opened. I did not give the order. I only saw the result. A release outside became a rush inside. People who had been trapped outside the entrance came through in numbers too large for the space to digest. They were not trying to cause harm. They were trying to get out of pressure. They were trying to enter a football ground before the match they had come to see. They followed the clearest path, straight ahead, into the tunnel. I raised my arm. I shouted toward the side. "This way! Use the sides! Keep moving to the sides!" But my voice had no weight inside that noise. A steward's voice is small when thousands of feet are moving. People near me heard. Some turned. Most did not. Not because they refused, because by then, the crowd was no longer made of separate choices. It had become movement. A man looked at me as he passed. He was young, red scarf, dark jacket. He opened his mouth as if to ask something, but the people behind him pushed him forward before any words came out. I remember his face because it lasted less than a second. Then he was gone into the tunnel. The match began. That is one of the things I still cannot understand in my body, even after all these years. The match began. The pitch moved. Players ran. The ball rolled. A whistle blew. And behind the goal, people were already in trouble. For a moment, the two things happened at once: football and disaster. Cheering and shouting. The ordinary and the impossible. Some supporters at the front climbed the fencing. At first, not everyone understood why. That is important. From far away, fear can look like disorder. A person trying to escape can look like a person trying to invade. A hand reaching upward can look like anger. But up close, there was no confusion. They were trying to get out. A boy was pulled over the fence. A man turned back toward the crowd with both hands out, shouting at someone I could not see. Another supporter pressed his face between the bars and looked toward us with eyes that made every instruction I had been given feel useless. I shouted again, "Stop sending them in! Stop the tunnel! Close it! Open the side pens! Get them out!" I do not know who heard me. Maybe no one. Maybe someone heard and could not act. Maybe the same words were being shouted by many people in many places, all arriving too late. That is how systems fail. Not always in silence. Sometimes everyone is shouting the right thing, and still the wrong thing continues. The tunnel kept taking people in. The central pens could not take them. That was the truth of it. A simple truth. A terrible one. Space had ended, but movement had not. I saw people trying to climb sideways into other pens. I saw hands gripping fences. I saw faces turned away from the pitch. I saw supporters helping strangers because no order came fast enough. One man pulled at another's jacket until the fabric tore. Another reached down from above and dragged someone upward by the arms. A steward beside me kept saying, "Get them over! Get them over!" His voice cracked. I had never heard him sound afraid before. The noise became impossible to separate. Whistles, shouting, the crowd, the match, police radios, metal rattling, people calling names, people calling for the game to stop. Then it did. The match stopped. But stopping the match did not undo what had already happened. The pitch became a place of escape, a place of rescue, a place that no football ground is ever meant to become. Advertising boards were pulled away. People were carried across grass. Some were laid down where players had stood minutes before. Supporters used whatever they could find: hands, coats, pieces of board, their own bodies. The stadium changed in front of me. One moment it had been a place built to watch a game. The next, it was full of people trying to save people they had never met. I remember looking at the goal. The net was still there. White, ordinary, absurdly clean against the confusion around it. That detail stayed with me. The net, the grass, the bright green pitch under a gray afternoon sky, and all those scarves, red against metal, red against concrete, red against the hands of people reaching. I moved because standing still felt like betrayal. I helped lift. I helped pull. I shouted directions I was no longer sure were correct. I pointed toward gaps, toward gates, toward anyone with a stretcher, toward anyone who looked as if they knew what to do. But very few people looked like that. Most of us were learning the disaster at the same time it was happening. A young man grabbed my sleeve and asked where his brother was. I asked what he looked like. He stared at me, not because he did not know, because the question was suddenly too large. Thousands of people wore red scarves. Thousands had dark hair. Thousands had come with brothers. He let go of my sleeve and turned back toward the terrace. I never saw him again. The loudspeakers said things I barely heard. The police line changed. The crowd on other parts of the ground went quiet, in uneven waves, like silence needed time to travel. Some people still did not understand. How could they? From the far end, it may have looked like a stoppage, a pitch invasion, a crowd problem. Words that were too small, words that had been used too quickly. At our end, there were no small words left. There was only the work of hands. Lift, pull, hold, move. Again, again, again. I remember a scarf tied around a wrist so someone could keep grip. I remember a ticket lying on the concrete, torn but still bright. I remember a shoe under the fence. I remember someone repeating a name until the name became a sound more than a word. I remember thinking the gates looked wrong. Not because they were closed, because they existed. Tall fences, metal pins, barriers built for control. They had been part of the ground for so long that people stopped seeing them. That afternoon, everyone saw them. There are moments when an object becomes guilty. A gate, a tunnel, a fence, a sign pointing straight ahead. None of them made a decision, but all of them held the shape of decisions made before the day began. Later, people would talk about planning, turnstiles, command, communication, capacity, pens, emergency response. They would use diagrams, timelines, statements, questions. They needed to. The truth needed structure. But inside the moment, truth had no structure. It had sound. It had weight. It had people trying to breathe where there was no room left to move. I do not remember when the afternoon ended. Disasters do not end when the danger stops. They spread into car parks, hospitals, phone calls, living rooms, news bulletins, families waiting, families being told, families not being told enough. They spread into years. For a long time afterward, I heard the tunnel in my sleep. Not screams, not the worst sounds, the tunnel itself, the low movement of feet, the growing pressure, the way a crowd changes when it stops being a crowd and becomes a single trapped body. I would wake up before the moment when the gate opened, always before, as if memory still wanted to warn me in time. People asked what I saw. I told them pieces. The crowd outside, the tunnel, the central pens, the hands at the fence, the match beginning, the match stopping, the pitch full of people who should have been watching football. But what I wanted to say was simpler. We should have seen the space disappearing. We should have understood that a crowd is not dangerous because people are bad. A crowd becomes dangerous when movement is still being fed into a place that has stopped moving. That was the sentence I carried. A place that has stopped moving. Years passed. The stadium changed. Football changed. The way people talked about that day changed too slowly. For too long, words were put in the wrong places. Blame was pushed toward those who had come to watch a match. Stories hardened before truth could breathe. But the families did not stop. They carried names through years of paperwork, through hearings, through headlines, through doors that should have opened sooner. They kept saying what should have been said from the beginning. The supporters were not the cause of their own deaths. They were failed by control, failed by planning, failed by response, failed by the first stories told afterward. I was only a steward. That is what I used to tell myself. A small jacket in a large ground. No command, no power, no final decision. But memory does not care how small your role was. It only cares where you were standing when the warning became visible. And I was standing near the tunnel. I saw the crowd go in. I saw the terrace stop breathing. I saw hands rise where songs should have risen. I saw football become silence. Now, when I pass a stadium, I do not hear the roar first. I hear the spaces behind it, the gates, the corridors, the stairwells, the places where people are asked to trust that someone has counted correctly, that someone is watching, that someone will stop the flow before movement becomes pressure. Because a crowd is not just a crowd. It is sons, daughters, brothers, fathers, friends, people with tickets still in their pockets, people who believed the dangerous part of the day was whether their team would win. History remembers Hillsborough as a disaster, a failure, a fight for truth. I remember the tunnel. I remember the way it kept taking people in. And I remember the moment I understood that the crowd had stopped moving, but the gate was still open.